Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Firstly, a word of warning. This isn't a usual episode of the show. It's the recording of a webinar I did with Tom Harden last week on decision-making under uncertainty. If you haven't come across Tom before, you can hear his story in episode 2 of this series. Tom and I thought it would be useful to host a webinar to discuss the challenges we're all facing as we try to take decisions during a time of uncertainty. If we're not careful, then that uncertainty can result in suboptimal decision-making. What we explore in our discussion are the dynamics of taking decisions in uncertain times and what we can do about it, both as organisations and as individuals. Because this was recorded on Zoom, the audio quality isn't as high as it normally is for this podcast. My apologies, that's just one of the limitations of Zoom relative to how I normally record. If you'd like to watch rather than listen to the webinar, the video version is available on the Human Risk YouTube video channel. Links to that in the show notes. I'll be running further webinars over the next few weeks on related topics. Details of those will be available on social media and in the Human Risk newsletter. With that said, I'll hand you over to the audio recording of my webinar with Tom Harden on decision-making under uncertainty.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Christian Hunt. I run a behavioural science firm that specialises in the deployment of behavioural science in risk, compliance, conduct, and ethics. I have been working with a number of clients both before and during the current crisis, looking at the risks posed by human decision-making, what I call human risk. And that plays out in terms of people either deciding to do something that they probably shouldn't do, or indeed not doing something. And inaction can be a decision, as we'll come on to discuss. I'd like to turn now to introduce my co-host, Tom Harden.
Thanks, Christian. I'm Tom Harden. In a previous career, I worked in the hedge fund industry as an investment analyst. And in my late 20s, I was actually charged with insider trading. And in the last, work with the FBI undercover, helped them build a bunch of cases in the States. And basically just threw my career away, really around very poor decisions that I made in my 20s. And fast forwarding now, about 10 years later, the last couple of years, I've been sharing my story as part of compliance training, primarily in the financial services industry, and of how we can make poor decisions, how we can rationalize those. And in the last year, a lot of my workshops and training seminars is really focused more on decision making. And so what I do with corporations is tell my story and then work in some of these decision making biases that we're going to talk about. And Christian and I have gotten to know each other over the last year or two, and have a lot of these conversations all the time. So we just thought we'd put together this webinar, have a conversation, and hopefully people can jump in with their own insights or questions and kind of keep it interactive.
So I think one of the first things that we wanted to pick up was really looking at the idea of decision-making under pressure. And of course, that pressure particularly amplified now, and there are some specific dynamics of the COVID-19 situation that I think are worth picking up that are probably relatively unique to that. But if we step back and think about the broader context of making decisions in challenging situations, Tom, I think your story is an excellent example of where the world suddenly changed for you, and you suddenly found yourself in a position that was surprising, where all of the things that you had held true suddenly fell apart. Can you just talk a little bit around some of the dynamics that you experienced yourself and that you subsequently talk to clients about around the sort of challenges of having to take decisions in a world you don't recognize?
Yeah, and especially tying it into some of the conversations I've had over the last month or two. And these uncertain times, and certainly I went through my own situation with this. We often executives, individuals, we certainly aren't spared the responsibility of critical decision making. And if anything, the time frame for making choices shortens, even as the uncertainty around making decisions becomes harder. And so what I've seen, talking to some of my past clients the last month or two around these issues is there's certain types of responses. I think the first response from companies sometimes is to recognize the existence the depth and complexity, but to kind of be paralyzed by the current situation. And that can lead to kind of slow, timid, or erratic decision making. And then the alternative response would be being very brash in the face of uncertainty, is sort of wish away the complexity. And one potential outcome is to have this kind of predisposition to arrive at fast, superficial assessments and simple answers without, often even analogizing the past experience, or to be overconfident about the outlook, whether good or bad, and the inherent veracity of those choices. So just thinking about how we might make decisions differently in this time of uncertainty versus when we have certainty, or we can quantify the risk when we know the expected outcomes.
And I think, Tom, one of the challenges around established processes is that they're established for a reason, and therefore they work very well, or at least theoretically work very well, in sort of quote unquote normality. And so people are very used to particular processes, be that particular committees for making decisions, or even in our own individual lives. We sort of get into a rhythm of things, and there's a very clear pattern in human behavior, which is we develop habits and then stick to those habits because we know it. And there's a sort of primitive evolutionary explanation around if it hasn't killed you so far, it must be the right thing to do. And of course, that works in a world that's very static. The moment the world becomes slightly or indeed massively destabilized, some of those patterns that we naturally fall into, the things that we might grab hold of, we either anchor ourselves to excessively. So we continue to do what we have always done in a sort of almost in terms of, if you look at fight or flight, in terms of flight, we're ignoring the situation that's there. We're just going to stick to the tried and tested because we know. Or the alternative is we throw everything out the window. The sort of, we'll fight this thing head on and we'll do whatever it takes. And so you end up with these two particular extremities. And of course, everybody is somewhere in the middle on these pieces. But the risk here very much is around that we throw the wrong thing out, or that we focus heavily on processes that might not serve us well. But our experience probably tells us that we feel comfortable doing that. And we can see that in many cases in terms of the sort of decision making that is being followed within many organizations, where many people have sort of said it's business as usual. And there is absolutely a sensible reason for doing that. But equally, one has to be careful to make sure that the processes that were being followed in quote unquote normal times are not, are still appropriate for the present time.
Yeah, I think adding on to that, one of the things that we can fall into in this situation, and I do it, and I'm sure people on the call do it as well, is this normalcy bias, the belief that things are going to continue or to go back to where they were just a few weeks from now, which can lead to an unwillingness or inability to plan for unforeseen circumstances as we're seeing today. One of the great stories here about normalcy bias comes from the book Black Swan. I'm sure many people have read that, by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, and he tells the story of growing up in Lebanon during the Civil War, and he was constantly told by adults during the war that it was going to end in a matter of days. And they were confident in the forecast of that duration. And there was a number of people just waiting in hotel rooms in Cyprus, Greece, and France, waiting for the war to end. And the war actually lasted 17 years. So this focus on, this is going to end in a few weeks until we can get back to normal. I think as decision makers, we can go through an exercise and throw that out the window and really look at when we go into a hybrid world of sort of today mixed with the past, how are we going to start making decisions? What is that going to look like? And I think what I've seen in talking to people in the last couple of months, humans, it's very hard for people sometimes to think probabilistically, and especially to assign probabilities on outcomes that are totally uncertain. And especially as we've seen with governments, to think exponentially. Some of the governments have done very poorly in preparing for this. The failure to think exponentially and probabilistically has been a problem. So working through exercises, working through frameworks where we can make decisions, we understand we have some biases, but if we work through a framework that we can kind of point those out to ourselves and not be trapped in this sort of spiral of normalcy bias, and maybe things will go back to normal in a few weeks.
And I think one of the very interesting things that I've been seeing with a number of clients where they have attempted to follow standardized processes is that those processes feel They feel comforting, which is why we stick to them, and they've been involved. But very often those processes can do several things. One is they can look like they're solving a problem in the short term. So we take a very quick strategic fix to something. It feels good. We have resolved the problem. And yet there are longer term consequences to that we don't always think about in the moment. And so we can see that particularly with companies that are sticking to compliance. So they're doing what their regulator or what the law requires of them. But that is a very short-term piece of thinking. And we're seeing lots of dynamics here where people are being challenged, not so much on whether what they're doing is legal, but whether what they are doing is ethical and appropriate. And of course, it is very easy to take quick decisions. When it comes to having ethical consequences, that can have a much longer term piece. And so this human dynamic of focusing on the here and now and trying to solve problems quickly, and therefore leaning or potentially on processes that are going to have longer term consequences without thinking can be quite dangerous. And so we've seen lots of examples. The one I like to quote frequently is my gym. They made a big song and dance about staying open for as long as possible prior to the lockdown here in the UK. And their argument that they came up with was to say, look, we're here for you. We're supporting you as your gym provider. And we think it's important that we're there for you until we possibly can't be. Now, the correct ethical decision would have been to shut down early and to close as quickly as possible. But they hid behind a community spirited piece and hid behind the law that didn't require them to shut down. Very quick, easy thinking to say, we'll do the right thing for our customers in the moment. The longer term, more correct thing to do would have been to close their doors early on rather than trying to continue in a regime that wasn't sensible. But there's a very simple example of a quick decision, which is we'll just continue doing what we have always done, that may for them have longer term consequences. Now, I'm not aware that anything particularly bad has happened as a result of that opening, but it could have done. And so we're seeing lots of quick fix solutions, and those quick fix solutions will either come from existing processes, or we may decide that this is such an abnormal time that we throw existing processes out of the window. And of course, one of the calibration pieces here is how much of the existing process do you need to throw out and how much do you need to keep in? And that's something that's very, very difficult for people to judge in the moment. And one of the things, Tom, I wanted to pick up with you was around the justifications that we use to make decisions. And I know in your past experience, you didn't knowingly sit there and say, I'm going to do something that's get me into trouble. But your behavior pattern was such that you were able to justify it to yourself as you're going. And I think this is a very key part around thing is that we will find rationales for doing things, particularly in a crisis where we have to make this, or we feel like we have to make decisions quickly. And actually some of the ways that we think don't help us in that regard.
Yeah. Tying into that and just talking to one of my past clients last week, they're in the situation, they're having these Zoom meetings, they're very distributed, and the temptation is to keep information close and hoard decisions at the top because it's a crisis and it's important. And what he was talking about was he's actually deputized people closest to the problem as he should, saying, just figure it out, do anything you can, take any action that you think you should take to figure out this problem, to solve this problem. Now, when you deputize people, you have to right now, but if you're telling people to do anything it takes to solve this problem, to make any decision, that's where we can kind of go down this slippery slope. And when I talk to companies, I talk about my own decision making, what I was seeing around me, how I rationalized poor decisions because of the environment I was in, what I was being told by my boss. We have to make money every month. We're a small hedge fund. And making a decision in isolation and not getting that help, kind of being deputized here as a junior partner to make decisions for the profitability of the firm. And we're kind of seeing that a little bit now where a good leader will have good intentions of, I know I should be sharing information. I know my board has told me to be transparent. I know I should be deputizing the people outside my organization closest to these problems, doing anything they can to make these decisions. But if you tell people, do anything you think you should, do anything you can to make the correct decision, I think you can get in trouble there if people aren't really thinking about these rationalizations, these situations they could be placed in, and of course the pressure we're all under right now to make decisions without all the information.
And thank you. There's some questions coming in, so we will grab those as we go. But look, just to respond to that piece, I think one of the dynamics that's very, very important in this space is the idea of challenge. And so in a crisis situation, one of the best ways of calibrating your own decision making, whether that's organizationally or individually, is to have somebody else take a look at it and opine on it. And ideally somebody that has a degree of independence, but you can trust that they're acting in your best interest. So generally speaking, in relationships, that ought to be one's partner. But it might be a function within the organizational environment that is used to challenging, be that audit, be that compliance, be that the risk function, to provide that degree of challenge. And I think one of the things that's very interesting that we're seeing in the crisis at the moment is a shutdown of scrutiny. And we can see that in the way that certain governments are treating the media, where there is a narrative of anybody who questions what we are doing is unpatriotic, is not helping the quote unquote war effort. And I think one of the interesting things here is that we know that in ordinary times, our decision making can be blinded by self-interest. That is going to be even more the case when you're making decisions quickly and you have a justification of fighting a common enemy. And in this case, there's a lot of language being used around war and battle, and the virus is being presented as an enemy. And of course, it is in some cases. But that battle narrative allows this depiction of people who are challenging the way things are being done as enemies. And I think one of the biggest lessons that we're seeing in this particular crisis around risk management is that the people that are doing best are taking in viewpoints from other people and reflecting that in their thinking. And I think the people that are not doing so well, and I'm talking both politicians, but also companies, are those that are not taking counsel from other people. And so we can look at certain world leaders and see that they are very single-minded and they're presenting themselves as war leaders, but actually they're clearly not listening to other people. And we can see the same thing with corporates. There are a number of interesting decisions made, businesses that threatened to stay open during the lockdown in various countries as a sort of act of rebellion, when all the advice was that they should be shutting down because that's what everybody's doing. And so there's a lot of, I think, a lack of challenge at this time becomes even more dangerous than it would do in ordinary circumstances.
Yeah, and the piece under that, one of the items that I talk about in some of my corporate talks before we shut down here is we try to understand potential outcomes and really relating it to this and think about what's the worst case scenario and sort of start to assign these probabilities. One helpful decision-making process that we can go through, which actually comes to military strategy and perhaps apropos because, we are sort of, quote, at this war with the virus, is to think about whether the result of each decision is recoverable or unrecoverable. So if they're recoverable errors, you can kind of continue to move aggressively. You're not going to have all the information right now, of course, but if you continue, call it sense making into the environment, if you can make recoverable errors and learn from those, and that's what you have to do right now, certainly do that. But if you're going to make unrecoverable errors, and so the war analogy, the military, talks about if we're going to have a helicopter shot down or have a major loss of life, that's an unrecoverable error. So in the corporate world, maybe a decision that risks your reputation. And so that's where you want to deliberately start to slow things down and not commit unrecoverable errors. And so in this complex environment, we don't want to worry about committing recoverable errors because that's how we all are going to learn. And that's how we'll be able to move faster than the problem right now. But I think people have a hard time with acting before they have enough information where they want to act. Where right now, we really have to make decisions and look at, is the error possibility here? Is this outcome going down the probability tree something we can recover from and we need to iterate and learn from that? Or could we be risking an unrecoverable error? And just something you're thinking about, especially today, just things that we can think about, little tweaks so we can use in our decision making to kind of think through issues as they come on the table.
And I think one of the things that's interesting is that there are a number of companies that have built processes that will naturally just get the right outcome in the current environment. And whether that's from an ethical standpoint or from a procedural standpoint, that they will have built environments that are codified and locked down where it needs to be codified and locked down, and free to allow human beings to use their initiative, where, as Tom says, that is the worst case scenario is it's recoverable. And my favorite example that I like to quote quite a bit is Netflix. And they have a very interesting culture there, which was created around the idea that they wanted to pick all the things that they didn't like about companies they'd previously worked in. So this is Reed Hastings, the founder, and his Patty McCord, his chief talent officer, so head of HR. And they came up with this idea of saying, well, one of the things that we hate is working for overly bureaucratic organizations that have silly, petty rules that require tons of sign-off and tons. So what they did is they looked and said, where do we need to have rules that are critical? So what do we really care about? And so a good example of something that's irrecoverable from a Netflix perspective is you don't want customer data to be leaked. You don't want customer credit card details out there. So that is something that they lock down very, very tightly and say, we under no circumstances can that happen. So we build tight controls and tight policies, tight procedures that are very, very strictly enforced around that aspect of it, because that under no circumstances do we want that happening. On the other hand, there are lots of areas where we can afford to take a risk, and as Tom says, it's recoverable. And so in those areas, they lighten up hugely and possibly even too far in some cases. But I think it's a really interesting example. And so the Netflix travel and entertainment policy is act in Netflix's best interest. And on the face of it, that sounds highly dangerous because people might do anything. But actually what it does is it forces people to think about what they are doing, because you have no rule that you can justify bad behavior with. You can't, for example, pick a particular restaurant because it just fits within the price bracket, or you can't fly business class because the cutoff is X hours and you've gone X hours plus 1 minute. You have to justify it on the merits of the decision on its own. And there's lots of examples of that. And if anybody's interested, there is a great PowerPoint deck that they put together as their HR handbook that explores some of these topics. But I think that's an example of a structure that will serve them well in this particular environment, where there are going to be unforeseen circumstances where an overly codified regime or an overly harsh regime that doesn't allow employees the latitude to think creatively about solving problems can be your undoing. Whereas what Netflix has done is they've freed up that human capital. And I think one of the interesting things as we look at this particular crisis is that the sorts of situations that people are going to come across, particularly in the front line, and that might be literally in the medical front line, but it might also be in the business front line, people operating in call centers, people operating at the customer end of the spectrum, may need to be given latitude to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do to get the right outcome. And so I think there's a really good example here where if you had a structure in place that was Netflix-like, people will be thinking about getting what objective are we trying to deliver rather than slavishly following the rules. Now, there are some situations where you don't want that to happen. I would argue we don't want people in a nuclear power station suddenly getting creative about what goes in the reactor. We don't want people with banking payment systems to be able to do what the hell they want. So we need controls around those. But it lightening up the areas and giving people latitude, I think, is a very important way of addressing that issue. That is clearly much easier if you have built the culture and the infrastructure around that in the first place.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think it's really important to tell people, if you're in the senior role and talking to people, that you really care more about their decision-making process. Right now, we're focused on getting the process right rather than the outcome. And this is something I'm sure a lot of people have read Annie Duke's book, Thinking and Best. She talks about the resulting bias. So we look at the result and we judge the decision based on the result. And I think it's really important right now, to your point, in this time of uncertainty, that we have people focus on the process of making decisions, and that at the long term, the outcomes, we'll get the right outcomes in the long term. In the short term, it's uncertain, but don't worry as much about the short-term outcomes. Still focus on the process of decision-making. And when I talk to companies, you kind of find two companies that say they're process-oriented. So especially in financial services, everybody knows the lingo. We're process-oriented here, Tom. We wouldn't have any type of these misconduct problems. We talked through the process, and one of my clients I was at a bank and talking to the CCO there, and he said we had a problem with the desk heads who were walking around and saying that some of the traders were taking this unnecessary risk, and they go in, but we're process-oriented. We don't care about short-term outcomes. We keep telling them that, but when we had these meetings and the CCO was sitting in, the desk head would say, why did we lose? Why did we lose here? Why did we lose here? And never ask the question, why did we win? And so there's all kind of white papers on this, but just something to think about right now, focusing on process rather than short-term outcomes, and getting people comfortable with not being worried about the outcome right now and focused on the process.
We've had a couple of questions in. Please do keep those coming. So we will take those. And what we want to do in the remainder of the session is explore some more of these themes, but then close out with a few ideas for things you can think about in terms of helping you to make better decisions, both individually but also within your organization. So looking at the questions that have come through so far, Louise has asked, have regulators' interventions in the last 10 years changed the inherent behavior and decision-making of banks? And I think that's a great question to both of us, because we have a financial services background in both cases. Look, I think, and I speak here as a former financial services regulator, I think one of the challenges that regulators face is that they are stuck in the middle. And we often look at regulators as being sort of the ultimate villain stroke policeman. And when we look at the way what regulators are there to do, they sit very much between the political classes and therefore the electorate and the banks themselves. And I think one of the challenges that regulators face is also that they have difficult decisions to make, and there are trade-offs between the objective they've been asked to meet, and sometimes those objectives are conflicting. And of course, the devil is always in the detail. I think what we saw in the 2008 crisis, and to a certain extent we are still seeing, because not all regulators have moved, is a dynamic where very clunky instruments have been used to deliver an objective. And those clunky instruments haven't always delivered the thing that the regulators are really wanting. And it's one of the real tensions that I had to grapple with. Moving from, I joined the regulator post-crisis, I then joined the firm that I had spent most of my time supervising. And so I ended up eating my own cooking, as I like to refer it, which is sort of having to implement the very things I told the firm to do as a regulator. And so I understand both sides of this particular piece. And I think some regulators have been tremendously helpful at guiding firms to think about things in the right way. So if I look at in the UK, for example, there's a really interesting anecdote that happened to me recently. I inadvertently overpaid my American Express bill by a few pounds. And ordinarily they would keep that money and then they would offset it against the next bill. They actually refunded that to me very, very quickly, without me having to ask for it, on a simple basis. And they sent me a note to say, you've overpaid, we're going to give you that money back because you might need it. And I thought that was a very forward thinking. Now, there is no regulation that has told them to do that. There is no statement by the regulator they need to do that. That is just them off their own bat thinking, how can we be relevant and helpful to our customers? So I would argue that, I think, is a super effective example of regulation working really well, where they haven't codified that particular outcome. But American Express has taken it upon itself to think about the spirit, if you like, rather than just the letter of the law. So from my perspective, that's kind of A-star good stuff. I think there are some terrible interventions that have caused unintended consequences, where there are processes that have been foisted on that, again, look good in, let's use the war analogy, peacetime, but aren't necessarily fit for purpose in wartime. And I think what we have seen with good regulators at the moment is them backing off and really cutting the firm slack in the right places, i.e. working out what do they really need to have them do and where can they back off a little bit in other respects. And so you've seen some very strong interventions. In the UK, for example, the regulator has forbidden banks to pay dividends, to even previously declared dividends, so that they will not need to ask for bailouts as quickly should that situation arise. So they're thinking ahead there. So that's very strong intervention. There's been a lot of soft intervention as well. So I think there's two examples of interventions I think are incredibly helpful. There are lots of examples of unhelpful interventions where I think regulatory imperatives have landed really badly in terms of the way firms need to react and the result of that for society. Tom, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on.
Yeah, I don't want to add, I don't have too much to add. I think you've covered all the bases, but one thing I will say is, sort of before, we have this pre-COVID and post-COVID time. Pre-COVID, when I was out doing live workshops and talking to people, I really saw a difference in my conversations with maybe banks in Europe versus US. And I think it's because in the last couple of years, perhaps it is these culture audits being done. I remember sitting about a year and a half ago and talking to the head of trading at one of the banks in Europe before I was going to give my presentation. I don't often meet with the business unit leaders, but the compliance officer who was bringing me in wanted to sit down and just have a conversation with the head of trading. And we had this conversation. He said, the FCA came in, did this culture audit, and said, we have a terrible culture. And he said, I thought we had a great culture because nobody says anything. And so that was just a year and a half ago. And going back and talking to that bank last fall, just about a year later, the real change in culture and awareness and accountability was pretty palpable. And now I've only had a handful of conversation with these individuals in this company. I'm not actively consulting, but seeing that change based on some regulatory intervention there, and that maybe just one anecdote, or that's something that's not true industry wide, but having those conversations really were different last fall versus a year and a half ago. And the states, I don't think it's changed much. We have different regulators here. We have a lot of regulation. Sometimes they don't communicate as well, but I was actually kind of inspired in my last couple of engagements in Europe last fall before everything shut down.
Right. And Kuhn Smets has helpfully asked a couple of questions. So thanks for that, Kuhn. Great interventions as ever from you. So the first question he's asked is about my gym that stayed open as long as possible. Do we know that your analysis is not just hindsight bias? How could they have known when it was the right thing to shut shop? And I think it's a very fair challenge. My response to that would be to say that I recognized it for what it was at the time. And so I agree with you. There are plenty of decisions where you could say, and this I think is a really, really interesting point around how decisions will be perceived later on. Because we often forget the heat of the moment decision making, where actually if you sat back and you had all the time in the world, you might come to a different decision to the one you come at when you're under a lot of pressure. And my favorite example of that is the movie Sully, which is the guy who landed the plane on the River Hudson. And my most interesting bit of that movie is the investigation that goes into the incident afterwards. And so what they do is they try and replicate the scenario he was in a flight simulator to try and demonstrate that it might have actually been possible for him to land at an airfield, and therefore implicitly that landing on the River Hudson was entirely unnecessary. And so it's a very accusatory, adversarial context. And they're looking in hindsight and saying, why did you land this thing here? You had other options. And it's overly dramatized in the movie, but the basic point that he makes is there is a difference between clear light of day decision-making and heat of the moment decision-making, where you may not have all the information, you may have limited time or feel like you have limited time, and you may be forced to take an action. And that action might not be the action you would take if you'd had all the time to think about it. So I think you make a very good point there, and I think it's worth thinking about in the current context, is that decisions that we make now could be viewed very, very differently in the future. And of course, that then sits with you forever. And if you've made a particular decision in a particular context, that context may not be visible to other people who will draw their own conclusions. Now, my response on the gym is to say, I think, firstly, I recognized it. Now, I'm very attuned to this stuff. And I was, as we were getting closer to lockdown, I was paying detailed attention to the sorts of messages that were coming from government and looking at the decision-making and the way it was communicated. So I spend my life living this stuff, and this was a case study unfolding in front of me. So I'm willing to cut them some slack from that perspective. But I do think that it was pretty obvious what they were up to. And I think one of the interesting pieces is that we can smell when people are taking decisions for the wrong reasons. And so I don't think anybody who read the emails that came from my gym that said, we're here for you, we're saying, we are, for example, repurposing our personal trainers to become cleaners, which I think sounded logical to them, but actually that scares the hell out of me, because what the hell do personal trainers know about cleaning gyms? Right? In my limited experience of using them, not very much at all. And so I think there's something interesting that says, yes, I'm more attuned to it, but I think it was obvious to anybody that read that what they were up to, which is we are pushing on through to maintain profitability for as long as possible, recognizing the shutdown might come for some time. They were not thinking about their customers, because the right thing to do for your customers would be to shut. They were thinking about the business. And I think had they thought about it, that would have been obvious at the time. So somebody somewhere took a decision that I would argue was at the time foreseeable. I am perfectly willing to accept, which is I know is the spirit of the question, that there are going to be other things where with hindsight is a wonderful thing, and we can look back on it and go, I would have done that differently. And that's based on having all the time in the world and an ability to think about things and having zero skin in the game. And so I very much take the spirit of the question. I think in that particular case, entirely foreseeable. And I think you don't need to have the kind of antennae around human risk that I have unfortunately developed, because I see it everywhere, to be able to pick that up. So I don't know if you want to pick up around sort of, how other people look at your decisions and the difference between what you were thinking in the moment and how other people might perceive that.
Yeah, just some thoughts there, especially our respective countries and the response, sort of first there was a denial of the problem, especially here, then confusion about the severity of the problem, then kind of slowness to muster the sort of response we needed. And then we've had this overwhelming response in the last 6 weeks of shutting down and stay at home. And I think in the corporate context and the political context too often we're trying to anticipate what's the decision where I can make it, and the best case for why this isn't my fault if it goes wrong, to what you were sort of talking about before. And the problem is when we start to reason that way, it's a very human bias to want to reason that way. I think about our risk profile gets really distorted because we're not aligned with that long-term best interest is in the situation. We're trying to protect ourselves against the short-term downside. And so we humans know that people will blame us for the way things go, as we said, how after the fact, when we look back, how these decisions will be looked at. And again, it goes back to this resulting problem I mentioned earlier. The U.S. actually had this Crimson Contagion plan that the U.S. government ran in 2019. Back in February, before it really got serious through the world, a friend who's sort of conspiracy theorist friend sent me this Crimson Contagion write-up little Wikipedia article. And the U.S. actually had run through this situation before in 2019 about a virus spreading from China. I think in the report, it started spreading through Chicago first rather than Washington State. And the report summarized the U.S. is not prepared. So this was actually out there 2019. That's a different discussion. But again, we can too often be in these situations thinking very short term. How can I make a decision now where my only incentive is I can say it wasn't my fault if it goes wrong?
And I think there's something really interesting about predictability because, we can all go back and look for, signs that this was inevitable. And you only have to look at the 2011 movie Contagion, which is pretty damn accurate in its depiction, available on Netflix at the moment if anybody wishes to enjoy that sort of movie of foresight. And there's only a few things that the scientific experts have said they got wrong. But broadly speaking, the movies demonstrated this thing was possible. So if an alien invasion occurs tomorrow, there'll be plenty of Hollywood scripts that could have told us that was happening. On a more serious note, we've got Bill Gates, who gave a TED talk a number of years ago predicting precisely this. We've got various offices set up and exercises that governments have done to predict this particular piece. So I think on the one hand, we can say this whole thing was entirely predictable. On the other hand, if we have to be very careful that we're not just selecting those particular things, because if we looked at the full realm of every single thing that might possibly happen, we're always going to be able to find some trace of evidence before that one should have followed. Now, I think in this case, there is far more compelling evidence than sort of flimsy, spurious evidence. But it is really interesting that the data set that you are using to take a decision in the moment is not necessarily the same data set that you will be judged to be judged to have had in mind when finally people come to look at it. So as you look at situations, I think the data sets that are there, aren't necessarily the data sets that you'll be judged on. And I always take a good example of if you're in court, the way that you will tell the story to the judge and the jury about what happened even if you're being 100% transparent, may be slightly different to the way other people would tell the story, even if they'd seen it. Partly because you have an agenda, but I think also partly because we all see things slightly differently. And that is a key point that we're going to want to pick up before the end, which is really having another pair of eyes on things is incredibly helpful. Now, had a helpful comment, I think, around, the pandemic was top of the UK risk register for a number of years. Absolutely right. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that this was not foreseeable and that we should be relying on the Hollywood movie thing. There is plenty of evidence. And this is why I think it's really important is at the moment we've got this issue in many countries where there's an argument about was this predictable, and you've got the wartime leadership saying, don't challenge me, I need to be getting on with this, we're trying to fight this common enemy and you are disloyal, versus and I think it's helpful to have a balance of those two things. We need to be constantly challenging and judging, because otherwise we get people taking slow steps to a very dangerous place. So I agree entirely. This one I think was entirely foreseeable because there was enough evidence out there that governments were thinking about it, not just in terms of theory, but actually in terms of practical policies that they had in place, but didn't necessarily follow through on. Let's pick off a few more questions. Koen again with Netflix is a really interesting case. There's a lot to be said to empower people to make the best possible decision in the firm's interest. However, questions can be asked about how far it is to expect a typical employee to be able to make the trade-off. People want to do the right thing, and sometimes the best way to do that is to set rules or at least strong guidelines. And then he references Timpson, which is a really interesting example. It's a company here in the UK, and you'll recognize this wherever you go in the world. They do a combination of dry cleaning, shoe repair, engraving, and key cutting, and probably a few other pieces. And so what they have, as Kuhn points out, is they basically empower their employees to spend up to, we think it's £2,000 to fix whatever problem. And it's kind of no questions asked, get on with it. And I think that's the similar mindset that you have in high-end hotels, where the concierge has a heck of a lot of discretion to give the customer what they want. And I think that's an interesting way of empowering customers. And you're absolutely right. There are certain positions where you can't expect people to have the wherewithal to be sort of thinking things through properly, particularly if you've hired them in a role where they are, it's very procedural. So I think it's interesting when you look at a company like McDonald's, they're very, very strict on food hygiene for obvious reasons, the processes, the collection, the payment systems, all of those things. It's very standardized, and that's what gives you the consistent experience wherever you go, because they're very procedurally driven. I think it's very difficult in that sort of environment, particularly with the sort of wages they're paying and the sort of people that they're going to be hiring, to suddenly say, as well as being slavish adherers to the process, we would also like you to use your initiative and be creative. Because actually it's very difficult sometimes for people to discern between, am I allowed to be creative in the way I cook this burger versus am I allowed to be creative in the way I engage with customers? And I think that's a really interesting point. And so I think it's a case of, when I'm talking in these terms, I'm particularly talking around knowledge economy, where there is an opportunity for that latitude to be displayed. But I think you're right. That is a very, very good example. The company, incidentally, also hires former convicts, which I think is a really interesting piece. So a very good example of a sort of social enterprise delivering it. So I think that's a very good example. Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, just as a corollary, I was thinking about, I was talking to a previous client last week or a couple weeks ago, and he said at their company, they were having problem with leadership, having this overconfidence bias, sort of, we're going to pull from the crisis management playbook here, and here's what we're going to do, and here's how it's going to look. And I don't want to think probabilistically because, we have these analogies from before when today, this pandemic is something new for all of us. And what he said at the board meeting, and they're having, I think most companies and probably people dialed in might agree, you're having more frequent board meetings over Zoom right now because you can and you need to. And he said at one of the board meetings a couple of weeks ago in the last board meeting, one of the board members brought up Jeff Bezos's principles on decision making. So just to work in Amazon with our Netflix discussion. And Bezos is famous for advising that decisions be split into two categories. So on the first category, you have these high cost, consequential decisions. I wrote down, I think he calls these one-way doors. And then on the second side, you have these low cost, reversible ones that he calls two-way doors. And what Bezos says when it comes to decisions that appear to be these one-way doors, he recommends asking a lot of questions and taking time and reaching a judgment. And so some of those questions worth including might be, why might this decision be wrong, or what would we need to happen for the outcome to be negative? And so that was just something that popped into my head, actually kind of tying back to that discussion on recoverable versus unrecoverable decisions as we think about approaching decisions today.
And I think interestingly, he undeniably, whatever you think about the business, is clearly successful. And that sort of tells us something. Moving on to the next question we've had from Louise here is how important is data for predicting behavior, e.g. past outcomes versus future outcomes? In the legal sphere, companies are analyzing judgments to work out which arguments, textbook quotes have resulted in successful outcomes. Barristers and judges can then be given ratings. Such rating could be used in traders' performances, but does this remove the human factor? So I think this is a really interesting point, because what you're looking at here is to say, look, does the past give us a guide to the future? And anybody who has bought any investment products will know that you are always told that the past is no guide to the future. There's no guarantee of future returns. And what I think is very interesting that we're seeing at the moment is this depiction of decision-making as being purely what is legal. And so we see a lot of particular and regulated industries, you can proxy in regulation for that. And so lots of people will say, we are following the regulation. We're doing what we're told. Precisely what my gym was doing, right? They are legally allowed to open until they're not, and they close with. Now, that feels really comforting and very comfortable, and it gives you a logical explanation as to why you've done something. The challenge, I think, comes is in the reckoning, and the reckoning might be a legal reckoning, it might be a regulatory reckoning, or it might just be the court of public opinion. And I think that's where it starts to get interesting, because I think if you have overly relied on the law, the regulation, and you fail the court of public opinion test, you may well find yourself either having a hostile reaction from your customers that can destroy your business, or you may well find yourself in a situation where the judge, if it goes to that issue, also looks at it and says, this is ridiculous. And so those of you that work in financial services and probably many other companies will recognize the idea of an attestation. So the way that we make sure that all of our employees are on the hook for complying with the rules is we force them to sign an attestation that basically says, I confirm that I have understood, read, and memorized all of the rules that are applicable to me, and I've complied with them. And that's a very logical approach. And somebody in the legal department said, this is great because we can fire someone if they haven't complied with this thing. So if they've said they've done it and they haven't done it, we can fire them. But of course, if you think about the process, you end up in the same situation you end up with what I like to refer to as the iTunes terms and conditions issue, which is when you download iTunes or any app or accept terms and conditions, you don't have time to read what they say. Because you just want, and in any case, even if you could, or if you bothered to do it, there's no negotiation going on. You just want to use this thing. So you're just clicking the box. It's what's called learned helplessness. And I would argue that I think those things that are designed to demonstrate that companies are sticking within the law or being compliant, that look really good on paper, I think will start to fail when things go wrong. Because even a judge is going to turn around and say, for example, to the CEO of the firm, so you want to fire this person because they failed to comply with policy X and they said they'd complied with it. But you've also signed the same attestation. What does it say on page 26 of the policy on conflict of interest? Oh, you have no idea but yet you've attested to it as well. So I think it doesn't even pass that legal test. So I think when we're looking at the way decisions are judged, of course you need to make sure you're within the law. But I think this comfort that we take from saying, well, I haven't done anything illegal, I haven't broken any regulation, is going to miss the point in the future when different standards are applied. And we've seen lots of examples of, particularly financial services products that were perfectly legal. The thing called payment protection insurance in the UK, which was theoretically useful insurance, was sold to loads of people for situations that might never arise. So technically legal and correct, practically for the majority of people that bought this thing, utterly useless, and therefore they were wasting their money. And the regulator overturned that thing and said, I don't care that this was in the rules, it's not within the spirit of the law. And so I think looking at the sort of assessment about what legal or regulatory risk am I running is only part of the game here, because we know the law and regulation will eventually catch up with where society is. And if society has decided you've done something it doesn't like, then you're going to find retrospective regulation that's going to come in and get you. So I don't think these formulaic things or analysis of past data is necessarily helpful for predicting the future.
Just to add there, for the sake of time, one nudge that I've found helpful, just sort of planning with people in my workshops, is talk to people when they're making decisions and critical decisions, just to think about, especially along these ethical lines or legal lines, can I, which is one answer, and should I, which can be a set of different answers and conclusions and outcomes. So I think just if you had to plant something with people as we're going through this and making really important decisions very quickly, just to have them think about the can I versus should I, because you might most likely get different outcomes.
Right. So 2 further questions we'll pick up, and then we'll close out with a few sort of final thoughts for how to manage this piece. Should we be spending time and resources in developing frameworks to make appropriate decisions rather than the decisions themselves? What should such frameworks include? I think one of the challenges is if you are trying to manage crisis situations, if you're trying to create frameworks on the hoof, that's quite hard work. And so I think it's a really unhelpful answer. But I would say, look, the way that you make yourself the most resilient in the crisis is you have a framework that can just adapt to whatever situation is there. So I wouldn't be saying to people you necessarily need to spend a lot of time doing it now. Clearly, you need to resolve the situation somehow. And I think if you recognize that the frameworks you have in place aren't operating effectively, then finding ways that you can pivot those frameworks, but making it clear to people why that pivot is happening, I think is incredibly powerful. And so you see a lot of companies disapplying rules, cutting back processes, shifting the way they do things because it's not appropriate in the current environment. The challenge comes if you want to try and reinstate those things later on, you need to be clear with people around what the parameters are. So I think it's very difficult, and that's why clearly, and it's the most unhelpful advice in the world, being better prepared, having a framework that can flex and bend appropriately is the best solution to this. So I wouldn't be spending lots of time designing a framework now, but what I would be doing is looking and saying, where are the obvious weaknesses in the framework that we have? Are there ways that we make decisions? Are there processes and procedures that are just not appropriate? And start with those particular things. And I think the lovely thing is if you engage the population of people, they'll be able to point out where the weaknesses are. They'll tell you which processes are really rubbish. And they'll tell you what irritates the hell out of them in the current environment. And that's a really good clue. And using staff as an early indicator of where things might be getting tight is particularly powerful, in the same way that getting other people's views as you're making your own decision makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, just to add on, I think frameworks are powerful because it really could take away our own biases. We talked about, one of my clients who mentioned overconfidence bias, or I talked earlier about normalcy bias. To have a framework, you could kind of take those away, but making sure, as Christian said, you're pulling everybody in and ideating and getting all these people the input pulled in. I think sometimes the way we're distributed now, people have great ideas, sometimes aren't going to speak up. So as a leader, you really have to pull those people in, maybe in side conversations or just check-in meetings every week, kind of get that input that maybe wouldn't otherwise be out there now. Because in typical Zoom meetings, sometimes you might have somebody who dominates the conversation and you're not getting all the input you need. So just thinking about today, how we may be able to apply some of those principles.
And the final comment again from Koen, so thank you for your contribution, sir, as ever. He said a key factor in decision-making under uncertainty is agility, i.e. the ability to change your mind. But even if you build that in, you're going to have this thing called sunk cost fallacy, which is I've decided on course of action A, I could change my mind, but I've made that decision already and I'm wedded to that particular decision-making. And you're right, that is one of the tough things. And there's plenty of evidence that being stubborn and pig-headed and pushing on through is the right answer and not letting anyone get in your way if you happen to have the right solution. And of course, that won't necessarily be known until the end. And my favorite anecdote around this particular piece is it's an interview that Darren Brown, who's an illusionist, did. And he was talking about the narrative that we're all told, which is if you want to be successful in the world, what you need to do is have single-minded purpose. So if you want to be a top athlete, top musician, just persevere. Don't let anybody put you off. Persevere, stick at it, and go for it. And that is a brilliant recipe for success. It is also, if you've got it wrong, a brilliant recipe for failure. And of course, what we see autobiographies and we see celebrities who have succeeded telling us that story. What we can't see is the mass of other people that have failed following that particular strategy. And I think there's something interesting here around worlds where, sure, there are going to be people that call this 100% right, but there are going to be a ton of other people who call it badly wrong. And I would argue that confident leadership is needed at the moment, not pig-headedness. But you're absolutely right. That's a challenge of frameworks. And how does one get that balance between those two things?
Just one point there. I think going into decisions today, especially with the uncertainty, that conducting pre-mortems and backcasts are really important. We often do these post-mortems after the decision. We'll write it up, email the CEO, analyze the decision, a post-mortem. But really doing a pre-mortem, like if we make this decision, how could things go wrong? Or a backcast, things really work out, which is what we usually want to do. We're really happy about things working out. How did that happen? But actually doing a pre-mortem, recognizing that, things that we're thinking about may not always work out. But what matters to us is we're foreseeing the landscape much more than if we got, a good outcome. If we get these two together, these pre-mortems and these backcasts, we see the entire landscape. We're more likely over time to end up on the good side of the outcome.
And I think that beautifully takes us, we've just got a few minutes left to kind of pick up what I think are the three kind of key themes that one needs to think about around decision making. The first one is around challenge and having the right people challenging process. So getting second and third opinions on things, but they have to be opinions that are open and transparent and not just yes people saying what you want to hear. So casting that out to get other people to take a look at something increases the likelihood of better decision making. Second one, I think, is what Tom indicated, which is you need to change the framework so that we are thinking things through and we're not just blindly following either things that we have committed to previously and we're just keeping going because that's the decision we've made, we can't shift from it, or cleaving to processes that have always served us well that might not now. And so that particular piece around finding frameworks and opportunities for people to do that. So yes, you want the people to be able to comment, but you need to provide the forum and the culture for them to be able to do that. So the second point then is around saying, do we have the wherewithal for people who want to be able to contribute, to be able to provide that feedback and that contribution. And so the willingness of people to do it in the first place is one thing. The second thing is then providing the environment where that feels particularly healthy. I think the third piece is around transparency and authenticity. And one of the things that we see quite frequently with particularly with global leaders, and some of the more sort of determined, pig-headed ones, is that they are not willing to fully level with their target audience. They don't talk about the realities of life. These are the same people, by the way, that you see in corporates who film videos in the office telling everybody else to work from home. Right? They basically position themselves as being unchallengeable. Everything's going okay. It's very North Korean in its messaging. And at a time of crisis, people know that things aren't normal. People know that things are unrealistic. And therefore, that transparency, that openness, and recognizing that it's a fluid set of dynamics and treating people like adults is probably the best way to get through to them. Tom, any thoughts?
I wanted to close maybe on my more individual level. Having gone through my own experience of self-isolation, uncertainty, bluntly throwing my career away at a very young age, I went through a period of massive uncertainty and still do to some degree to this day. And just some experience that I've had dealing with this. We're all, going through some amount of disappointment right now, missing weddings. We had a friend, we just had a Zoom funeral, which is terrible to have to go through now, but that's the situation. So we're experiencing anxiety and that type of thing, and it comes from that uncertainty. I think a couple of frameworks we can use and just sort of things we can do mentally. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but just my own experience is when I was out of work, had thrown my career away, thrown my reputation away, I got really into endurance training. And I think going through uncertainty like this and like training for endurance events, there's some parallels in terms of sort of setting appropriate expectations now. Know that there's going to be highs and lows over the next few months. Focus on productive actions, everything that you can control, and not worrying about things you can control. I'm sure we're all talking to people that are in our lives are going through all the what ifs and ands and what if and that, and we can't control any of that, but we can focus a lot only on what we can control. Understand that the goal's down the road, but you've got to really focus on the mile that you're running in right now. And it actually always helped me to think about that things could always be worse. We've been asked to shelter in place and work from home. That's a pretty good spot to be. And one kind of finally daily affirmation that I've been using the last 12 years, and not, again, take it for what you will, but in the morning, I always say, I don't know what's going to happen next week or next month, but I knew that, I'm alive and well today, and I'm not going to waste this day. And just trying to end it here on something more on an individual level, as we're all dealing with a situation now that we've never really dealt with before.
Excellent. I love that. That's a nice positive finish for us all to take away. Thank you so much for joining us. We will make the recording available as video and audio. If you want to reach out to either of us to discuss any of these issues, please feel free to do so. There's another one of these webinars next week. I will send you details. That's looking at conduct under COVID, which is looking at sort of behaviors and how we understand that in the present environment. But with that said, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you found it useful. Please do let us have feedback or any other thoughts. And in the meantime, please stay safe. Remember to wash your hands. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
That's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. Normal service will resume with the next episode, but I'll be sharing future webinars on this channel as well. If you're not a subscriber to the podcast and are interested in hearing more about human risk, then you'll find the Human Risk Podcast wherever you get your quality audio content. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe. And I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.